I am the New York State DEC coordinator for the Niagara River Area of Concern. And today I wanted to talk a little bit first about the Areas of Concern program for those who might not be familiar with it. And specifically to the Niagara River, there's a lot of work that's happened over almost 35 years now. So I thought I'd concentrate on what we've been looking at most recently, which is habitat restoration and investigating contaminated sediment and moving towards cleanup of that sediment. So an area of concern, they were first defined under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the U.S. and Canada in 1987. And the Water Quality Agreement really governs the entire management of the Great Lakes between the U.S. and Canada. Specifically for areas of concern, the definition was updated in 2012, and they're defined technically as areas where there's been a significant impairment of beneficial uses as a result of human activities at the local level. To put it another way, an area of concern is really just a location that's had greater environmental degradation than the rest of the Great Lakes. So the general goal is then to improve the environmental conditions in the area of concern and to restore the beneficial uses to a state that's similar to areas outside of the area of concern. The goal is not to return these areas to a pristine condition. It's just to kind of get them up to the level of the rest of the Great Lakes. And when we reach that level, the AOC designation no longer applies, so the area can be delisted, and then other Great Lakes programs that have a wider scope will address any remaining problems. So we talk a lot about these beneficial uses and beneficial use impairments, and they're also defined in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And what they're defined as is a reduction in either chemical, physical, or biological integrity of the waters of the Great Lakes that it's sufficient to cause any of 14 specific conditions that are listed in the agreement. And a couple of examples here are restrictions on fish and wildlife consumption or loss of fish and wildlife habitat. And each of the AOCs defines a set of removal criteria for each of the beneficial use impairments that are present in that AOC. And those criteria have to be satisfied before that impairment is considered to be restored. And then once all the impairments are restored, according to those criteria, again, you can move to delisting the AOC. And the way the areas of concern are addressed, either the U.S. or the Canadian government cooperates with the appropriate state or the provincial government to develop a remedial action plan and then to implement those plans. So the plan for the Niagara River was developed in 1994, I should say the U.S. plan, because as a binational area of concern, there is a separate remedial action plan for the Canadian side. A little bit of history. Initially, funding specifically for the areas of concern was very limited, and New York was able to address a lot of the problems and the contaminant sources under its core programs, the DEC's core programs. For example, there were a lot of hazardous waste sites along the Niagara River due to all the past industrial development. And DEC has addressed those under the state Superfund program, and in some cases the federal Superfund program was involved. Bringing us up to 2010, when the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative started at the federal level, that has really accelerated the progress that's been made in areas of concern throughout the U.S. Great Lakes. So specifically on the Niagara River, the area of concern includes the whole river and a portion of the Buffalo Outer Harbor that you see here. So it starts from the mouth of Smoke Creek at the old Bethlehem Steel site and extends all the way to the mouth of the Niagara River at Lake Ontario. It only includes the water. It doesn't include any land areas. It does also include 4 tributaries that are considered to be source areas because they have contaminated sediment. And we are considering adding more tributaries to the AOC. I'll talk a little bit later about how we're still doing some sediment investigation in some of the other tributaries. So those may be added to the area of concern at a future time. And the reason that those tributaries are added to the area of concern is just so we can address the sediment with the help of federal funding. So moving on to the habitat restoration that's been occurring over the years. In total, DEC and other parties have started more than 45 projects of differing scale since the RAP was published in 1994. And I have to give credit to the New York Power Authority. They've made a major contribution under their 2007 relicensing for the Niagara Power Project. They agreed to implement 8 habitat improvement projects themselves, and they provided considerable ongoing funding for other projects. Some of the 8 habitat projects that they implemented were concentrated on the island area, the Motor Island, Strawberry Island area near the south end of Grand Island, which is historically a shallow area of the river. And my understanding is that the shallow areas are very important for the life cycle of a lot of fish and bird species. But over several decades in the last century, those areas were mined for the gravel, and it really destroyed the available habitat there. So some of those projects have been focused on reversing that destruction, restoring some shallow areas to that important habitat area. Then looking forward, a few years back, the DEC, along with our Remedial Advisory Committee for the Niagara River Area of Concern, wanted to basically plan where we were going with habitat restoration. Again, we had to satisfy the beneficial use impairment. We had to sufficiently restore habitat so that we could eventually remove that impairment. So we developed a plan after considering many potential habitat projects, and we call it the AOC Habitat Plan. It calls for completing a total of 12 projects, and altogether those will restore about 100 acres, primarily of shallow water and coastal wetland habitat. And that's been identified, that type of habitat has been identified as the most serious loss type of habitat that's been lost along the river. There's been, because of all the development along the upper river, there's been a lot of dredging for navigation purposes. There's been filling of the shallow areas for various reasons. And that very productive habitat has been lost to a really great degree. So that's what we're mainly trying to restore. So our habitat plan was approved by EPA back in 2019, and the significance of that is that EPA will then fund a very good portion of these projects using the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative money. So where we are right now, of those 12 projects, we have 3 that are complete. 3 more are currently in construction and should be completed by the end of this year. 4 other projects are now in design or in other pre-construction activities, the contracting process. And at least 2 of those are expected to start construction this year. So we are making good progress. That leaves 2 other projects that currently aren't funded. One is the Cherry Farm landfill that has the potential to start next year. We've been in discussions with EPA about receiving funding, at least for starting the design of that project. And there's also going to be a juvenile sturgeon habitat project, which we don't have a location for yet because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing a study to determine the habitat needs of juvenile sturgeon. specifically in the upper Niagara River. So once that type of habitat has been identified, they'll look for an area that's appropriate for restoring some of that habitat, and we'll do a habitat restoration project specifically for that purpose in the selected area. An example of a completed project is the North Pond project on Unity Island. This was a Corps of Engineers project. They used sediment that was dredged from the Buffalo River to create a more shallow area within the North Pond, which was just basically a featureless area. You can see the difference after the construction. The sediment was added. There was planting to create more shallow water, more wetland area. And in addition, part of the berm that separated the pond from the river was removed to allow fish access to this area. So this project will benefit fish, certainly, which is, you know, of course, one of our goals under the remedial action plan. The other projects that are currently under construction are the Buckhorn Island State Park project, which is a shoreline wetland project, the Grass Island project, and project at Spicer Creek Wildlife Management Area, which is DEC property. And I wanted to kind of show an overhead view to give you a little better idea. The Grass Island area is right here off the north shore of Grand Island. That area of the island itself has been undergoing a lot of erosion. It's a very valuable habitat because it's a shallow area in the river again. But a lot of the habitat has been lost, as you can see from these photos, and that's due to natural erosion, and to some extent it's due to human causes. There's a lot of boat use of the area. Boaters like to spend the day in the shallow area, and you know, while they're entitled to recreational activities, it's really been harming the habitat. So the goal there is to put a stop to the erosion, and this slide shows the design. The primary feature stopping the erosion is this large set of berms, stone berms, that will block wave energy that comes from boat wakes, and it will block the ice that comes down the river that causes erosion. There's also going to be extensive planting to fill in some of the areas where vegetation has been lost over the years. So this project, as I say, is underway. The main berm in this area has been constructed. The other ones are under construction, and there is planting going on currently. The Buckhorn Island State Park project has a similar purpose. There's a need to block wave energy from boat wakes and to stop the erosion that prevents wetland vegetation from going into the area. So again, there will be rock reefs constructed along the shoreline. They're also going to use some anchored log bundles to provide a little bit of variety. So it's not just rock, there'll be wood features too to provide a little bit of more habitat. And those will also help with the protection from waves. And also some smaller rock sills and some logs at certain locations that'll form protected areas for vegetation and for the use of fish. The DEC project that's underway, again, is the Spicer Creek Wildlife Management Area project. You can see there's a shallow area all along the shoreline. We have historical records that show that this area used to be just filled with wetland vegetation. That's not the case anymore, most likely due to, again, the scouring, the erosive effects of boat wakes that, you know, weren't present basically 100 years ago, combined with water level fluctuations that are caused by power production, has kind of created an extensive area where erosion occurs, like perpendicular to the shoreline. So we see pretty much total loss of the vegetation that used to be there. So this shows the design of the project. These blue features are going to be, again, rock reefs that will block wave energy. We're also using in this project some wood features, which are the more reddish and purple features shown here. So this project started back in April. There was a restricted work period for all of these projects that went from May 15th through the end of June because of fish spawning. We didn't want to interfere with that. So the projects have started up again as of early July. This project in particular should be completed around early September. And I do have a few pictures here from the earlier construction. You can see the wood features chained to concrete ballast blocks that will hold them in place on the river bottom. Then just getting on to next steps on habitat. Obviously, we will complete the implementation of the habitat plan, and that's it's not going to be the fastest process. We have a project out in the outer harbor filling in one of the slips with sediment from the Buffalo River, and that's going to require dredging of the Buffalo River through 3 cycles that the Corps of Engineers does every other year. So that project itself will stretch out to at least about 2028 or so. So we are looking at some time to finish this habitat plan, but again, I'm confident it will be done. Afterwards, there will still be habitat projects happening. As I mentioned earlier, the New York Power Authority has provided a good deal of money. So that will be available for other habitat projects, specifically in the Niagara River. And then obviously we'll want to monitor and maintain these projects. We've made significant investments, and we're not just going to walk away and let them be overrun by invasive species or other problems. Moving on to talk a little bit about sediment investigation and cleanup. Over the past few years, the state and some federal agencies have been collaborating on a strategy to address sediment in the Niagara River. And currently we're tracking a total of 17 areas where sediment cleanup may be required with varying degrees of likelihood. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Great Lakes Legacy Act, which provides federal funding to allow EPA to both investigate and clean up contaminated sediment. It's very important. We certainly don't have the resources within the state of New York on our own to implement these very expensive cleanups. So EPA is able to conduct investigations at 100% federal expense, but for cleanups, they, by law, they do require a minimum of a 35% non-federal cost share. Also, a responsible party can be participant in this program, but in that case, the cost share is 50% that they have to provide. So it's a good program. There are some challenges, though, because of the cost share requirement. It's still a good deal of money that either the state has to come up with or a responsible party, if there is one for some of these sites. The contamination's been around so long that there are no viable responsible parties any longer. So a little bit of history. So there's been sediment sampling in various parts of the river and its tributaries. Since 2014, we did some in 2017, 2018, and 2020. And our general plan is to address sediment basically in 3 sections of the upper river, working from upstream to downstream. So I have a list of the areas that may or may not require sediment cleanup, and I'm not going to go through each one, but what I did want to note is we do have some other tools. Besides doing sediment sampling just to determine what chemicals are present in the sediment. We can look at whether or not the sediment is toxic to basically the benthic community, the organisms that live in the sediment. So, although we may see contamination in the sediment, if we're not seeing any impact on those organisms, then remediation sediment cleanup may not be required. So that's a tool we've used at a couple of the locations listed here. So certain other locations, we look at fish tissue, collect fish samples and see if the contaminants are being taken up by the fish from the sediment. Again, if we don't see that, there may not be a need for remediation. Again, this is the area stretching down from about Cayuga Island down to Gill Creek. And we're using some of the fish tissue analysis again in these areas to determine if there are impacts. As far as finishing up sediment investigation for the AOC, EPA awarded money to DEC last year so that we can do some additional sampling in 3 of the tributaries and in one section of the Niagara River itself along Bratwick Park. And we expect that that sampling should complete all the investigation that's necessary for the area of concern. We had intended to do it last year, but because of the fiscal concerns related to COVID, we didn't get approval to spend the funding. So we are working on working to identify a contractor now who can help us with the sampling, and we are hoping to finish that sometime this year, provided we can get it done before the weather gets too bad to work out and do the sampling. So next steps then for the sediment will be obviously to complete all this sampling, and then generally we'll just have to compile all of the data that we've been collecting and determine which areas require cleanup, and then it will be a matter again of working with the Legacy Act program and US EPA and identifying the non-federal match that's required with that program to drive these cleanups. So there's really not a timetable for that at this point. There is a lot of demand across the U.S. areas of concern for that Legacy Act program, more than Environmental Protection Agency can fund right now. So, it's just a matter of competing priorities across the U.S. areas of concern. So eventually we will get these areas cleaned up. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any at this time.